Okay. So, I do have a big interest in plants these days, but
Microphone there.
gotcha. But my history is really a lot more ecological based. That's what my master's degree really focused on, was ecology. So this is that kind of brought me to thinking about this, and also some questions that people were asking when we were out working at various different garden situations about this term. And so anyway, that led me to create this little presentation. Please don't hesitate, Dick, for the people on Zoom as well, don't hesitate to stop me during this. It's not a very long presentation. I'm happy to go off sideways and discuss any aspect of this that interests you. First of all, these questions started coming up partly because this idea of succession comes up with reference to gardening in a lot of different ways. So that was causing some confusion right there, that if you're planting crops in a series so that you get a steady harvest, people call that succession gardening. In your landscaping, if you're trying to make sure you get blooming throughout the season, people will refer to that as succession gardening. So again, a little bit of confusion, and that's not what I'm addressing tonight. So what I'm talking about is what's known as ecological succession. And it's kind of it's a transformation that happens in the landscape following a disturbance or any kind of alteration. One of the things you have to remember about ecosystems that's really important is that it's very dynamic. There's so many different interactions going on. You've got the flora, your plants, you've got the animals living there, you've got the basic environment and all of its characteristics. And one of the things that people probably don't like to hear about is that ecosystems aren't stable. They're never meant to be stable. They are ever changing, ever dynamic systems. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on what what ecological succession actually means, but then give you some applications for what does that mean to you when you're trying to landscape your property. Okay, so this is what we call primary succession. Now, primary succession happens when an area has nothing living on it yet. It is bare rock. And I'm going to give you a little bit more specific idea about this in just a minute, but this is, your typical website kind of picture that you can pull down, that if you're starting with bare ground, bare rock, nothing alive, there are small living organisms like lichens that might be able to take hold. Once they have lived there for a while, it does start changing the nature of that specific area. So I will elaborate a little bit more in a minute. Because of that change, there is a chance for small annual plants to start taking hold. Lichens are actually, they're a very interesting organism. They're a combination of algae and fungus, so they're extremely hardy and they can live on any kind of surface. But eventually plants can start living there. And then eventually some various grasses and perennial plants can start living in that space. And then some more complex plants such as shrubs, smaller trees, and eventually you get to what we call a climax community. This is what that particular ecosystem is constantly moving towards, is a climax community that represents the most complex situation that will exist in that particular area. Okay, that's just the kind of pat definition for primary succession. Now, let me show you what it means for us. Okay, so again, let's say we started with bare ground and you have these nice little organisms called lichens. And what makes lichen able to live on any surface is that the combination of those two organisms, an algae and a fungus, means that they both supply something to the organism that makes them capable of living with no other help. The fungus is basically the moisture and the home. The algae photosynthesizes, makes the food. So you've got a food maker and a home right there, ready-made. So they can live on any kind of surface. But once you get some lichens living there, imagine that when the wind is blowing, like today, wind is blowing and dust kind of accumulates and soil accumulates, and slowly but surely, there's a little bit of soil in that location. Yes.
So how long does it take a lichen area to actually generate?
I'll get to some numbers in a little bit. It takes a while. It takes a while. And of course, yes.
I thought it was interesting on your previous slide that the second succession showed the mountain had eroded almost by half.
Yeah,
So
I know. There's all there's all kinds of fun pictures you can try to use for this idea. That's why I decided to do something real, because it's easier to picture in your head, right? When you have something real. So the lichens living there, remember, anything that lives in a space too, any living organism creates some organic acids in the process of its living. So that's also going to change the nature of that bare rock a little bit. So there's soil accumulating, there's a little bit of organic acids, there's bits of lichen that are decomposing, and suddenly you have conditions that are capable of now supporting what we call, and by the way, that's considered a pioneer species. Anything that can colonize a not colonized area is considered a pioneer species. Okay, so we have some gradual replacement by first simple annuals and simple grasses. Depending on the ecosystem, it will vary, but those simpler organisms are able to take advantage of what the lichen has provided and take hold. Once they are established for a while and the conditions improve a little bit more for more complex plants, you may get something more perennial, shrubby, like this lovely Zexmenia that I put in there. Okay? And eventually, as this ecosystem matures, as the soil develops and gets better and better, and the conditions change a little bit, eventually you will get to what we call a climax community. And by the way, and this is not new material, this is very old. If anybody tries to challenge that ash juniper belongs here, the climax community for this ecosystem is an oak juniper forest. Oak juniper. Yeah. It will end up being a savanna, but if you don't do anything at all, it may end up being a forest. So if you ever wondered if the junipers actually belong here, they've been listed as the climax species, one of the two, for a very long time. So anyway, this is essentially how the stages of succession would progress if you started with nothing. But that's not usually what happens, right? More often than not, what you have happening is what we call secondary succession. So that's happening all around us all the time. Anytime there's any kind of disturbance, it sets that ecosystem back. Maybe not all the way to the beginning, but it sets it back. Okay? So you might have fire. You might have some kind of clear cutting going on. You might have grazing. All kinds of things would serve as disturbance. Even a single tree falling over in a forest, creating an open spot, is enough of a disturbance. Okay? So every time there's some kind of disturbance, it sets that ecosystem back towards earlier successional stages. And now that ecosystem starts to recover and move back through at least some of those same stages again towards a climax community. It's always moving towards that climax community situation. And it just depends on what's left over after the disturbance. If there's enough vegetation left over, if there's a decent seed bank left over, then you haven't set it back all the way to the beginning, just back to some of the earlier successional stages, and it'll move forward again. And this is oftentimes faster than primary succession because that soil has already been produced. The conditions have already been changed to favor some more complex plants. So it'll move back through those stages faster. Now, one of the downsides that we see that happens after disturbances, depending on where the disturbance is, how severe the disturbance is that this is an opportunity for invasive species as well. So invasive species are also typically in our situations, in our areas, a little bit more generalists, and they don't have a lot of threat to them. There are not a lot of different organisms eating them. So depending on what the seed bank and the resulting or the vegetation that's left over looks like, you could find yourself with something that looks like one of these terrible empty lots full of, nothing but Malta star thistle and bastard cabbage and some of those lovely plants, because they also take hold very quickly. That's how they've managed to take hold where we are. So that's what secondary succession looks like, and that's what we are typically experiencing over and over and over in our ecosystems. Now, what if we focus on Texas and go through this same idea again, but focus on Texas, and now we'll add some numbers.
There was a comment.
Yes.
The gorge is an example.
Yes, exactly. That was a major disturbance that set that area, and it changed what geology was exposed as well. So in a typical pioneer stage in Texas, remembering that Texas is big, but in our area, a pioneer stage can take anywhere from 0 to 5 years to finish out. And a pioneer stage is usually characterized by plants that are very hardy, that are very fast growing. So what you can expect to see is a lot of annuals and some specific grasses, which I'm going to refer to some of these books I brought in today, which you're welcome to come up and look at afterwards. But this is where I got a lot of my inspiration for today. What is happening during the pioneer stage is that the soil is stabilizing, as I already mentioned. It's slowly forming more complex layers, better organic layer, better organism-filled layers, with lots of microbiota. And the whole idea of nutrient cycling within the ecosystem is starting to happen. It's starting to get set up. Okay, so eventually the soil gets better. Early successional plant, because they're annuals, right? And I'll show you here. Well, these are my grasses, but they're annuals, and they seed a lot, and they love disturb areas, right? Aren't bluebonnets a perfect example of an early successional species? So I've been focusing a lot on grasses too, especially around my property. I start noticing what grasses are popping up on their own. And I started getting curious about, well, do these represent earlier successional grasses, or are they later successional grasses? How that helps guide me on what's going on currently, right? Well, here's some good examples of early successional grasses. So these have very low requirements, right? Very low nutrient requirements. They can handle thin soil. They don't need a lot. They don't need a lot of nutrients. So green spangletop, that's one that I see a lot on my property. And I was happy to see that it's there on its own, because that means that habitat is developing. But it does tell me that, okay, this is early successional. Hooded windmill grass is a big one, Texas grama, old field 3-on, which I had found, and sand dropseed. And you can find good information in the weirdest places. You really can. So I got this book from a speaker from TxDOT, not Andy Blair, but another speaker a while back. And I don't use it much, but I started flipping through it because I had a feeling they might view things a little differently than a lot of other people. And I noticed that if you flip through, especially the grasses, well, even they call them, well, they did a weed section. I don't quite understand, but then they also have a wildflower section. And for a lot of the plants, they actually list whether they're considered early or late successional plants. So like I said, you find some really good information in the weirdest places. Okay. Here's another good example of early successional plants around our area. So bluebonnets, and it occurs to me also because I keep giving talks on native plants, and from a taxonomy standpoint, we have a lot of legumes in this area. Everything from the simplest bluebonnet to the sennas, to some trees like kidney woods and Eve's necklace and golden ball lead tree. And so all the way up the chain of succession, we have a lot of legumes, which tells me right there that we must have some pretty deficient soil in general, right? Because they can handle the nitrogen deficiency on their own. And then of course they are adding nitrogen to the soil just by being there as well. So it just makes sense to me. Oh yeah, we have a lot of legumes here. Anyway, paintbrushes, thistles, lemon mints, black-eyed Susans, a lot of these lovely annuals, those represent earlier successional stages. Now, I'm going to keep coming back to this idea.
Those are common roadside species specifically because of the disturbance of road construction.
And see, that's another good indicator. If you're seeing these plants pop up on roadsides, that tells you that they must be able to tolerate disturbance.
Somebody on Zoom is asking for references for the books.
I can do that. We could post it on the website. How about that? I'll post all my references.
The Dick, want to put in the chat?
I have 2 books here that I didn't. Actually, I have a couple books, but yes, if you want to put these
Well,
Both of-
let me put it on the website.
Yeah, okay.
If
Then-
Anybody else? that
Yeah,
comes and looks-
everybody can take advantage. Yes, we'll make sure these references get on the website. And not, you know, these books not necessarily useful in their entirety, but I keep finding these wonderful little gems in them. Okay. Now the transitional stage, so this is moving past moving past the kind of pioneer stage into a little bit more complex plants that are capable of living there. And notice that stage is very long, potentially, because it depends on so many factors, which I'll talk about some factors later. But it can go from anywhere from 5 to 20 years to go through these transitional stages. And there is a constant replacement of plants going on, more competitive plants, plants that are longer lived. So now your perennials are coming on and your little shrubs are popping up, right? When you see shrubs popping up in your, you know, in your landscape, then that tells you that there's enough soil developed there to support shrubs. That's a little bit later in the succession. And you're going to get a little bit more diversity and more complexity in your ecosystem. And I'm going to come back to this idea too in a little bit later about ecosystem complexity. So here are some later successional grasses. And of course, this is not by any means a complete list. These are just some ones I thought you might be familiar with. But some of these bigger grasses, right? These are your bigger bunch grasses, your perennial grasses, eastern gamma grass, side oats grama, or state grass, switchgrass, yellow Indian grass, these lovely big bunch grasses. And they're wonderful for wildlife habitat, right? They're very good for that. And then, like I already mentioned, you eventually, and it could take 100 or more years to get to an actual climax stage, depending on your particular situation, what your landscape looks like. But once you get to a climax stage, then you have your climax species that are now living there, your biggest, most complex trees that are able to live there, like our live oak and our ash juniper, your big bunch grasses and your nice perennial grasses. And this ecosystem is somewhat stabilized as best as is possible. And you have the best diversity that you could possibly have. However, I'm going to throw several wrenches into this whole business, especially if you're thinking about, okay, so what do I need to do? How am I landscaping to accomplish all this? Or how can I be a part of all this? So many things are going to affect how succession progresses on your property. As you probably know, the climate is quite diverse across Texas. So we can't just really talk about Texas in general. It's just too diverse for that. The precipitation varies so much across the state for our annual precipitation. And it's also, and the temperature varies. And it's why we have all these different ecoregions that we recognize. Because we recognize that there's so much diversity in this state that we have lots of different kinds of habitats that exist. But I'm going to focus kind of on where we are. And if you're interested in the Gulf or you're interested in the Panhandle or something like that, you may have to dig in a little bit more. But especially with the kind of weather we've had the last couple of years, you know, we've had some hot temperatures. We are low on rain. We are already seriously low on rain for this year. And so your best drought tolerant species are probably doing the best right now. Soil. So what exactly does your soil look like? What is its condition? That's going to affect how well succession can proceed in your on your property. So the texture of the soil matters. One of the things that was pointed out to us up at Madrone Trail recently is that there's some areas that, and we actually did some weed whacking when maybe we shouldn't have, and exposed more ground than we should have when we're having a drought. And you can end up with these areas that have really parched, crackly kind of soil on top, almost flaky soil on top. And it's going to be different, and it gets compacted when these things are happening. Or if you've got equipment that's been going back and forth across that terrain, it's going to compact the soil. And now you've made it that much more difficult for, you know, your plants to get established and to move through succession. Also erosion, as was pointed out to us by several of our speakers lately, even last month with Michael Eason, that what has eroded, you know, a lot of our organic layer has eroded in a lot of our areas, and that's what one of the things we're deficient in. It may be difficult to ever get a complete cycle of succession to happen again if you've changed the conditions so completely, right? There's the concern that, you know, even if we tried our best, we're never going to see the kinds of prairies that we used to see in the amount of acreage that used to exist because the conditions have changed pretty significantly. Also, I don't know who all's out there, what your situation is, but if you're living on a city lot, then of course, all of that soil was probably removed when your house was put in. And soil was put down, depending on whether you had control of it or not, that might not even be local or appropriate soil. And the seed bank was probably removed at the same time, right? But if you're lucky enough to be more rural and the impacts are less, you know, you've never completely scraped it clean, there's potentially some of that soil still existing and there's still a seed bank, then your ecological succession will look very different than somebody whose land was scraped. Okay? So a lot of different things to, to think about. What kind of disturbance has happened on your property? Fire was a very common disturbance and considered very positive, but flooding, grazing, each one of those can have a different impact. I liked this picture here on the left because it showed a perfect fence line situation where on one side there was no grazing, on the other side there was grazing, and that left side, of course, has been set way back in terms of ecological succession. And if the grazing was severe enough, there may not be much left for that, you know, for that habitat. It may have a very difficult time progressing through succession again. So, also, what kind of biodiversity exists? And of course, we have some control over that, right? If you don't have a good seed bank, then finding sources of seeds can be a really great way to kind of jumpstart your property towards, you know, a lot more diversity and going through a nice succession and producing a nice habitat. I brought I brought an example of Native American seed catalog. Because first of all, it's a great source of reading, but second of all, if you start looking through some of the seed mixes that they have, one of them is actually a roadside mix. You start reading through the list of seed species that they're going to provide you in some of these mixes for reestablishing. They're all early successional species. So they're designed for that disturbed situation. They're designed to take hold quickly and help your landscape start moving through a little bit more and more diversity. So I thought, you know what? I bet they do. Yeah, they do. Those mixes are specifically geared that way. And we know we have a lot of different species interactions that can affect what's going on in our ecosystem. Deer, for example. One of the problems we have with deer is that they love to eat all of our new little tree seedlings, right? And we are seeing a decline in the population of some of our lovely native trees because the deer don't ever let them come up. So that's another way that we can kind of intercede. We can become a part of that solution to help some of those trees to survive, or plant them and make sure they get caged for a while and let them actually get established. I'm trying a new little experiment on my property, the area that I don't really manage a lot. I happened to notice under a small group of trees, a couple wafer ashes that had gotten to be, I don't know, a couple feet tall already. The deer didn't get them. So I started putting, when I started trimming my plants, I started creating a little brush barrier to enclose that little group of trees and make a little protected space for those little wafer ashes that I had already found. So I created an exclosure to the deer, right? They can still move through my property, come and go almost as they please, but I'm trying to protect some trees that I discovered because it is getting to be a problem. Anyway. Okay. So I wanted to kind of finish up by talking very specifically about hill country and I don't know, some suggestions I have, some thoughts I have for how you can move forward. So in the hill country, as I already mentioned, we're kind of an oak dominated habitat with grassland. So essentially we live on a savanna. That is kind of our habitat type. If there hasn't been extreme disturbance, we typically experience somewhat moderate succession rates. So you can expect to go through, you know, in the time that you live there, to see a variety of different kinds of species start being able to live there. One of our most prevalent problems is overgrazing. You can see a lot of ranch lands that have been overgrazed. I've seen a couple little smaller properties like along 1863 that clearly have been grazed by goats so severely. The only thing that lives on that property is prickly pear. It's nothing but a field of prickly pear, right? That is overgrazing to an extreme. So if overgrazing has occurred, then you can expect the ground cover to be very short and probably some big areas of bare ground. So these might be situations where you have to just start seeding with the simplest plants you can seed with and try to remove some of that, you know, like prickly pear or whatever that's taking over. Some of the grasses that you could expect to see in these overgrazed situations are very resilient grasses like KR bluestem. King Ranch bluestem, which is an invasive plant, but it takes hold very quickly. And if you happen to discover threons, like Old Field threon, that tells you also you have a fairly degraded piece of ground right there. Mhm.
Well, KR bluestem be crowded out once the soil and
It-
conditions improve.
It can, yep. And I'll tell you what, I've been involved in activities where we've tried to remove lots of KR bluestem, especially like up at Madrone Trail. And we've had some new guidance from Andy Blair, if you're familiar with him, who actually does work for TxDOT, but very capable biologist. And his guidance is that even undesirable ground cover is better than no ground cover, especially when we're experiencing this year after year of drought and high temperatures. So what I did on my property in some spaces where I saw it was a lot of KR was just cut some of it off, like at about ground level, make sure I got rid of the seed heads and then chop the rest of it up and turn it into mulch, right? I'm mulching with what I'm trying to get rid of. And yes, eventually I could get some of that KR crowded out by better grasses. But I've got to improve that soil a little bit too, so that it isn't just KR that wants to live there. Mm-hmm.
I was on it was a bird thing with Craig Hensley,
Mm-hmm.
and I was asking him about KR. We have several spots, mainly where construction was done or trucks came in.
Mm-hmm.
And, couple things he suggested, one would possibly just get, I do like 4 3-foot circles and introduce a grass in that area, and it will eventually possibly take over. And then also, when I talked to Native American Seed, they said the closest grass that's native to KR is cane grass, cane bluestem,
Cane.
cane.
Oh,
I think
it's silver.
cane.
It's similar to silver. Yeah.
And it needs the same soil and everything. So if you're pulling KR out and you throw those seeds in, you're introducing something that takes the same soil type.
Okay, I just want to share with everybody on Zoom here real quickly. So a question or a comment was made that in the trying to mitigate a lot of KR bluestem, that maybe you take small areas at a time, take that KR out and try to replace it with something that has a very similar characteristic, cane bluestem being one of them, which is a similar looking to silver bluestem. Yes.
The other good competing native grass is little bluestem, and it is a pioneer,
No, it's later successional.
later successional, but it
Yes.
does compete.
It will compete, but it is a later successional grass. He was asking about, we were talking about the possibility of also using little bluestem in place of KR, but I feel like that's a little bit more of a later successional grass. So you may or may not have success with that one right away, but I believe the cane bluestem or the silver bluestem, those are good options that are very similar to KR bluestem in that situation.
Pretty much anytime you're removing invasives, you do want to replace it with something else so that it can crowd out and shade out. In this case with KR bluestem,
Right.
that's like but depending on the invasive you're removing and if the area has an intact seed bank or not, you're probably going to want to bring in different species to replace different things you might remove.
Right. Yeah. So we had one more comment about if you're removing invasives that, you should think about trying to replace what you took out with something that is native, that is appropriate to that situation. In the more South Texas plains, it's a little bit more of a thorn scrub kind of situation and savanna, and a lot more drought tolerant. And in that kind of thorn scrub situation, the succession rates are a lot slower. So it also means that a disturbance is going to have a much bigger impact on your habitat than, say here in Central Texas on our Edwards Plateau where we are. So I want to move a little bit into some more good practices, because, we can help kind of guide what's happening on our landscape. If we know there's been some kind of disturbance, and we're trying to provide good habitat for wildlife, which that's what most of us, I think, are thinking about when we're putting in our native plant landscape. So I talked about succession tonight because I think if you understand the general idea of succession, it can help you in your restoration activities, in your processes, because it gives you an informed place to start and how you could expect it to progress from there. And of course, if you manage disturbances so that they don't get severe. For example, one of the presentations by a PhD student at the symposium was regarding the rotational grazing idea, which is kind of going back to, I think, what used to happen long ago, but it makes sense, especially in these kinds of habitats where you can truly degrade that habitat to the point where nothing's ever going to grow there, nothing's going to come back. So this rotational grazing idea is a way to still have that agricultural practice, but do it in a responsible and sustainable kind of way. And of course, in drought, you're going to have to keep the cattle off of it even longer. So kind of the bottom line, and I've got a couple little things to say after this, but I wanted to give credit to, I found most of this information about succession by Googling, by the way, and it was compiled by Texas Parks and Wildlife, USDA, and A&M AgriLife Extension. That's who compiled this information about the idea of succession in Texas. But as you can see, it's a very complex process. It will vary by ecoregion. So I want to finish up with just a couple ideas about what that really means for what we're trying to do on our properties. And I'm trying to synthesize a few things together here that I said before. So as far as managing your habitat, one of the things that's been pointed out to me and other groups several times lately is that our soil is most lacking in organic material. That is what has mostly eroded off of our landscape. So that is really the amendment that is needed. You don't need to bring in lovely, nursery soil, but if you do any composting, or, you have access to good compost, organic material is the most needed amendment on our soil. As I mentioned, soil compaction can happen, especially with all the drought we've had, if you've got a lot of clay in your soil, and if equipment has been run over your landscape a few times. So you might have to mitigate that compaction with even just an aeration or something like that in different areas. You can help that. Yes.
We know it's 400 folks that are doing up from north to south to go.
Mm-hmm.
We claim that the best, organic material compost is alfalfa hay.
Alfalfa. Okay.
Is that
I just compost out of my kitchen. And so that's what I put out, especially in certain areas, is my own compost, just so that I'm adding some organic material back. And especially if I'm planting something that has more needs, like a tree, especially, I'm going to try to add some more to it. And of course, like I already mentioned, you can look for some appropriate seed mixes out of places like Native American Seed. They have great suggestions for basically a roadside mix that will give your property, if you've got bare spots, some of those seeds should be able to take hold even in that degraded situation. And having plants live somewhere makes it easier for plants to live somewhere, if that makes any sense. Just the fact that the plants are living there and putting roots down into the soil means that there are various organic acids being exuded into that soil. And then there's also the decomposition as those plants die. If you're growing a lot of little simple annuals, I remember watching one, yeah, what's that?
The shade.
And shade, but if
Shade the
you,
ground, but let's
yeah.
say microorganisms.
Yeah. But you can even do something as simple as, I remember seeing a landscape presentation a couple years ago that because they had this management group had such a big area to manage, what they threw out to establish plants in some areas was radishes. Because radish seeds germinate in 3 days. And they're not going to live there that long, but they're going to improve the quality of that space. They're going to hold the soil in place. They're going to add some organic acids. They're going to add some more organic material as they die. So it can be a fairly simple approach just to get some cover on your ground. So think about that. Sometimes seeds might be your best bet, especially if you've got really rocky ground, to get something established. Now, we are at odds to 2 different ideas, and I will add this to my list for what goes on the website. But we had this gentleman that came and talked about his book earlier this year, right?
June last.
In June, okay. Rufus Stevens, Jan Reed, that's called Land Stewardship for Birds. And I thought, well, I'm not that interested in the bird aspect of it really. However, the stewardship was what I was really looking for. And there is some fantastic information in this book about how to manage. And of course, well, back myself up for just a second. If you want wildlife on your landscape, which, like I said, I think a lot of us do, and birds are a nice thing to see there. If you back yourself up, birds need insects because almost 100% of them feed insects to their young. Whether they're seed eaters as adults or not, they need insects. Insects, like our different forbs, for the most part, not entirely, but more forbs usually equals more insects. And if you're not familiar with the term forb, it refers to just those simple little annual plants that they're not long-lived. Okay, think of a meadow that's full of forbs. But those later successional bunch grasses that I was showing you are great for providing nesting sites for those birds. So if you want the whole ecosystem to happen, you kind of need both. That's actually a problem. I'll explain. So here's a lovely meadow in bloom, right? That's something we find very attractive, something we like to see, but that's rather early successional. And that can't be maintained like that without constant disturbance, right? Because it's going to want to move into shrubs and trees, and you're going to have less and less and less meadow over time if you don't have disturbance. But this is perfect for getting a lot of those different kinds of insects in your habitat that you might like to have. Here's those lovely big bunch grasses that are later successional bunch grasses. So how do I have both? How do I keep early successional wildflowers and later successional big bunch grasses and shrubs and trees simultaneously? And that's what we used to do, right? Dick just said periodic fires. Yes, that's how we always did it, or that's how it always happened. But, that's not always possible anymore, right? So in the absence of fires, in the absence of big grazers, one way to accomplish that maintenance as kind of a meadow, your early succession, is to mow. But you have to be careful how and when and where you mow. Because if you mow too frequently, you're going to suppress those bunch grasses, and those bunch grasses are potentially nesting sites. You wouldn't want to do that right now or very soon, because you could disturb all those birds that are nesting. So spring and summer is going to destroy nests. And mowing typically doesn't remove a lot of the litter, which happens when fire happens or when grazing happens. So you still have all that litter piling up. I'll come back to that in a second. So here's our conundrum. That we'd like to promote those warm season grasses. Those are the bigger bunch grasses. And if you want those on site, you can only mow once during the dormant season, like in the winter. If you want a lot of those forbs, then you're probably mowing more frequently to let them keep switching out. What is being recommended, and that was in this stewardship book, is that you create a mosaic. Basically, you go back to having this kind of savanna setup, where in some areas you let it proceed towards the bigger bunch grasses and the shrubs and the trees, because that provides nesting sites, but you have some open areas that you keep mowing a little bit more frequently, and you keep that at more of a meadow situation, an early succession situation. And you'll have to keep doing that, otherwise you will lose your meadow, right? So just kind of something to think about, you know, what I'm really advocating is that we go back to where we were. This I found in that, actually, this is another great little book, The Natural History of the Edwards Plateau. I love natural history books because they give you big picture kind of ideas. That's why I like them. So prior to Euro-American settlement, the Edwards Plateau was a grassy savanna with little groves of trees. And fire, as we already mentioned, fire was the major disturbance that would set it all back just enough where you'd keep getting these lovely flushes of all these wildflowers before it kind of proceeded back to some shrubs and trees. And so it is possible, I think, to keep all of that happening on your property, just kind of maintain it in some slightly different areas. Like I have one spot where I'm continuously putting down compost, and I've been putting in some big bunch grasses, and I've kind of left that, you know, that's kind of away from where I'm trying to keep wildflowers coming in constantly. And at some point, I'll probably have to give it some kind of major disturbance, get the weed whacker out or something and set it back. Because I'd like to keep seeing those flushes of wildflowers, even though I really like to also have shrubs and bunch grasses and trees on site as well. But just, that's something to think about. Those two things are at odds with one another. Yes.
We could talk about 3 years ago at Cibolo,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a speaker from the highway system. And they
TxDOT.
have to choose when to mow according to what grass or what plants they want.
Mm-hmm.
And supposedly that information is online somewhere.
I would imagine so, because that booklet I showed you came from TxDOT. Sarah was mentioning that TxDOT actually does try to do their mowing thoughtfully in such a way as to be able to keep the different kinds of roadside plants that they're wanting to maintain there. And I have heard that before, that they do have a protocol. They do, they are trying to not just indiscriminately mow at any time of year anymore, which is good. And we just need to adopt the same kind of practice on our own properties and keep this little mosaic idea going on. Yes.
Read somewhere that, their maintenance budget is, dominated in some cases by mowing.
Mm-hmm.
And so they try to do practices where they can cut that down.
Right.
I know for a while, for a few years, they tried just putting a lot of trees in between two roadways there.
And then they don't come back and water them,
Right.
right? Yeah. Comment.
Big shade, no.
Yeah. A
The
comment.
problem.
One more comment was made about the roadsides that TxDOT does spend, a lot of their budget can go to mowing. And so it's not surprising that that's somewhere where they'd probably like to cut their costs a bit. And if they're more mindful about when they do the mowing, they can obviously do less of it. So anyway, I think that is it. That's my last slide. So if anybody has any other questions or any questions from the group on Zoom?
Good. Debbie's gonna do the drawing for our door prize.
All right. Let's see, we have, everybody get your tickets out. Last three numbers are 231. Oh, Sarah. Anybody online, or okay, I think we kind of kept up with questions. Yes, ma'am.
We live on Lake Shore
Mhm.
and we don't have much of a lake anymore.
Mhm.
Because of the drought, but we had a present. When we walked down close to the lake, we have this huge field of bluebonnets,
Mhm.
which just
Surprising.
and I guess that's the primary succession, right?
Right, so
Yeah,
it's,
The blue water is now going to be.
Yeah.
blue.
well, exactly, yeah, so, so I guess on some of these, in some of these lake areas that are shrinking, they're seeing bluebonnets growing up where the soil has now been exposed, and that makes sense, it's now a disturbed area. And thankfully, something is growing there. I think that's a good thing that the bluebonnets are there. Yes.
On Zoom, how do you get rid of litter from home?
Well, I mean, you can try to bag, as you're mowing. I do that sometimes, and then I use the clippings as mulch in different places. So rather than putting it directly back down onto the ground, you can collect it and just do small areas. Try not to mow big areas all at once.
It works as a good green in your compost too, because
Mm-hmm.
you want that mix of your browns and your greens to make the best compost. So it's really good
Yeah.
for that as well.
Exactly. So if,
Never give away your organic material. We don't have
Right.
enough of it.
yeah, so the comment was made that if your clippings are green, and you have enough space in a compost, you could also use it there as part of your compost. That, I think that's probably everybody. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. And like I said, if you're interested in any of these books that I used as my source material, you're welcome to come see them, take a picture, whatever. I referred to this one a little bit, but honestly, I do like the natural history and stewardship kind of books because they always give you the bigger picture approach to things. So that's where I go for my best material.
So a big thank you to Debbie for presenting this evening.